We are talking today with Lauren Kessler. Lauren Kessler is an author and journalist. Her writings have appeared in publications such as the New York Times Magazine, Los Angeles Times Magazine, O Magazine, Salon, and The Nation. She is the author of 5 books, including Clever Girl, The Happy Bottom Writing Club, Full Court Press, and Stubborn Twig. And she is here to talk about her latest book, Dancing with Rose, Finding Life in the Land of Alzheimer's. If you would begin, start out and tell us what was the motivation in writing your book, Dancing with Rose?
Well, the motivation was like the families of 5 million other people in the United States. My family was touched by Alzheimer's, the disease. My mother was diagnosed with it. And I brought her out to, she lives in the East Coast. I brought her out to the West Coast and was involved very intimately in her life for 6 months of the last year of her life. And I saw up close what the disease did, but I didn't really, it's hard to explain this. I mean, I did all the things that a dutiful daughter is supposed to do, but I didn't allow the experience to touch me because it was too painful. And so when everything was over, meaning when my mother died, I realized that I had a lot to learn from something and from this experience, and I hadn't learned it, and I had to force myself back into it to learn it. And being a writer, I had the privilege of, say, not signing up for 7 or 10 sessions at a psychotherapist, which is how you would process this. Instead, I decided to write about it.
So you did that by actually signing on to work at one of these facilities?
Well, at first, no. At first, I thought I would just be the journalist that I am. So I did a kind of standard journalistic treatment. I observed at various Alzheimer's facilities. I called up a bunch of experts. I did interviews. I did all kinds of research on the research, and I put together a piece that was published in the LA Times Sunday magazine. And I thought, okay, I'm finished with that. Now I can move on the rest of my life. And I came to the revelation one day. I was probably either in the bathtub or running, which is the 2 places I have revelations, that I had done exactly the same thing as I did with my mother. In other words, I had moved back from the experience. I had detached myself from the experience and actually not experienced it. And that's when I decided I was going to work at an Alzheimer's facility. And so I applied for the job very legitimately. I was not an undercover operation. I didn't pretend to do this work. You can't pretend to do this work. It's very serious work. So I was what is called a resident assistant, which is a bottom-of-the-rung, minimum wage caregiver at a residential memory care facility.
Maybe we could, if you could briefly describe what Alzheimer's is for those people that aren't familiar.
I'm happy that if you're unfamiliar with it, congratulations, because there's so many people that are touched by this that it's hard to find people that aren't. Alzheimer's is mostly a disease of the elderly, although there is something called early onset Alzheimer's, and it is a brain disease. It is a disease that actually causes changes in the brain, kind of clogs up the brain, almost the way arterial sclerosis clogs up arteries. And your short-term memory is drastically affected, and then your middle-term memory, and then your long-term memory, your ability to take care of yourself, cognition, thinking in general, and you progressively forget how to do pretty much everything, including how to feed yourself, how to go to the bathroom by yourself, etc.
And like some other diseases, it's a little different for everybody.
It manifests very differently, yeah. You can, the people that I took care of, I'll tell you that in this job, I cared for single-handedly between 11 and 14 people with Alzheimer's, mostly women, because women live longer than men. And that care involved everything from total care, people who needed to be hefted out of their beds into wheelchairs and couldn't bathe or toilet or dress or feed themselves. So that was complete care. And so your question was about how Alzheimer's affects people. And so at the very end, that is pretty much what Alzheimer's looks like, that total dependence. But there are also people for whom I basically woke them up and I said, it's time to get dressed. And sometimes I would help them choose what they were going to wear, or they might choose something that wasn't completely appropriate, and I could choose for them again. And they just needed they needed the safety of that place, and they couldn't take care of themselves in terms of making their own meals or going shopping, or they couldn't drive. And so I provided those services. Sometimes people stay at a plateau with Alzheimer's, and in a kind of a foggy state where they are capable of walking and maybe talking but not carrying on a very deep conversation. And I mean, two people of the exact same age can be diagnosed in the exact moment, and the progress of their disease can be completely different.
So you began at this facility, and in the beginning you received training?
Well, yes. This is I received 6 hours of training, which was basically sitting in a room with the other people who were also going to be hired and reading the employee manual aloud to each other, which I thought was one of the more bizarre experiences much more bizarre than taking care of the Alzheimer's patients. But actually, you don't need a high school diploma to get this job. You don't need a GED, equivalency, and probably you don't need to be particularly literate. And so I think that it was probably a smart idea to have people read out loud, because I don't imagine that some of those people would have read the employee manual. So that was one day of training, and then we had 2 days in the unit itself with a person who'd had the job before, who was our trainer, and we shadowed that person for 2 days. And then third day, we were on our own. Very scary.
And it sounded like it was fairly scary the entire way, at least in the beginning, where you kept asking yourself, is this really something I can do?
It was physically the most grueling job that I have ever done. And emotionally, it was pretty grueling, mostly because I came to it with so much baggage, because every time one of my ladies did something, said something, or there was some body language or some behavior, and it would trigger a memory of my mother. So that was kind of difficult. But it is, it's the kind of fear. It wasn't fear of the disease. I wasn't, freaked out about the disease. It's the same sort of fear, I think, that a new parent has, when you have somebody's life in your hands, and you know that a decision that you make one way or the other can actually affect a human life. And, there are jobs like that, say, doctors, but they're very, very highly paid, and they are very highly trained. And I was neither.
But actually, you are a parent. So as you just compared it to, and one of the things that comes up in your book, you have said that other people compare Alzheimer's to, dealing with children. But as you point out, that's not really a fair comparison, because children learn over time, whereas people with Alzheimer's are
forgetting. Yeah. Well, I think there's something good and important about seeing the connection between Alzheimer's patients and children, and something bad. The bad part is the first part I'll talk about, which is I think possibly many of us have been in hospitals or nursing homes or in situations where we hear that very fake voice that is sometimes used when talking to older people, like, okay, Dolores, let's go do this. Don't you want to get out of your chair? That kind of thing. And that just makes my skin crawl. I do not think that, these are adults. these are grown-ups. These are people who have lived 60, 70, 80 years, and they deserve our respect, and they deserve dignity. So I think we cannot treat them like children in that way. But in another way, it is good to think of them as children. For example, most of us who've been parents, although we lose our tempers at various times, we cut our children a lot of slack. If a kid, if it takes a child a long time to learn something, and children have various behaviors that are upsetting, or in public they're weird and we're embarrassed by them. Children are in diapers. Children need to be fed. And yet we seem to do that with a smile on our face. And we seem to do that with, grace and gladness. Whereas when it's for an older person, it's sort of, they're smelly and icky and disgusting, and we want to put them away someplace and not think about them. And so in that way, if we could look at them as children and deal with them with that kind of grace, that would be wonderful.
So getting back to your experiences there, your first day, which you were justifiably very apprehensive about, that sounded, when I read it, that sounded like it was actually a pretty traumatic day.
Yeah. Generally, people don't have a first day like I did. I actually had a death in my, they call them neighborhoods, my little unit of the facility. She didn't die that day, but she had an accident that resulted in her death. And, when I took this job, I think I realized that, we're talking about people in their 80s and some in their 90s, and to put it one way, it's a dynamic population. In other words, they're not going to last forever. And I knew that there was going to be death. I just didn't know there was going to be, I didn't know I was going to face it that soon. And it was traumatic. On the other hand, another one of those lessons that you learn, because we don't live with the elderly a lot in our culture anymore. They are either, if they're healthy, they're in leisure world, they're in retirement communities, and if they're not healthy, they're in assisted living. But they're not out in our communities the way they are in, I was in Italy last summer, and you walk down the street and there's old guys walking around, and really ancient people sitting on benches talking to each other, and they're just part of the life of the town, and you don't see that very much here. So getting used to death, it is this. I mean, it's the same. It's part of life, and it's hard when it happens to you. And a lot of people ended up dying, not while I was there, but subsequently. Most of the people that are in the book, not all of them, are no longer alive. And you have to accept it as part of the natural course of life, just as birth is, instead of fearing it, forgetting it, and putting it away someplace behind closed doors.
And what also struck me about your recounting that first day, in addition to that one incident that was, again, fairly traumatic, was once you got that all taken care of, it was, I mean, you can tell us you wanted to go take a break, you wanted to get away from there and just collect your thoughts, but it was like you have so many things to do in a day there that you had to dive right in and just continue on with your day.
Yeah, the work, if you've never done this kind of work, it is extraordinarily intense. As I said, there were 11 to 14, depending upon if all the rooms were filled with people or not. There were 14 private rooms, one-person rooms. And that's a lot of people when almost everybody needs some kind of help. So when you're finished with dealing with one person, whatever it would be, helping them take a shower or calming them from some panic attack or something like that, and you wish that you could go sit down and have a cup of tea and think about it, or in my case, take notes and just process it. You can't. You have to go right to the next. It's the people who do this job are extraordinary. I mean, they're paid minimum wage. There are no benefits that I could see. There's no health benefits. There's no dental benefits. There's no holidays. There's no sick days. You have to clock out for lunch. It's unpaid. I mean, all those kinds of things. My coworkers were generally third-generation working poor women. Their mothers had them, when they were 15 or 16, and they had their kids when they were 15 or 16, and they had grown up in poverty, and they were working. I mean, they were all working 40 hours a week, and they were still in poverty. So part of the book really is an investigation, if you will, of these two marginalized, invisible groups. One is the Alzheimer's patients, and the other is this nickel and dimed group of working poor women, and how they come together and create this community in elder care.
And yet these elder care communities are charging a fair amount of money. Do you think they're just basically these giant profit centers making money off both the patients and the people who work there?
Well, it is a huge industry. And although there are, like a lot of industries in the United States, it is increasingly corporate owned. So there are some giant elder care corporations that have hundreds and hundreds of, could be assisted living, could be memory care, which is what when they don't want to use the A word, they call it memory care. And it does, it costs a lot to do this well. And one way in which you can apparently scrimp and get away with it is in the employee costs. There are other ways you really can't scrimp. So it is extraordinary that people are paying $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 a year to stay in these places, and the people who are taking care of them are bringing home $15,000 a year before deductions.
And did you feel like you were in one of the better facilities?
Well, I wasn't. I was in a relatively new facility. It is corporately owned. It was, I think, it's a fairly large corporation, Elder Care Corporation, and it was not a terribly expensive one. I would say it's probably middle of the road. So I think the quality of care was extraordinary, but I shouldn't say extraordinary. I should say the quality of care to me was amazing, given how stressed and underpaid and overworked the employees were. I really thought that my fellow workers were, almost all of them could be nominated for sainthood.
There was a high turnover rate there. What did you see in those fellow workers that, kept them working at a job that was such low pay?
Well, same thing that kept me working there. It is, given all of the negatives that I've just talked about, the idea that you can spend your day, diapering adults, for example, to take the chore that most people would consider the most onerous and do it for minimum wage. It is a soul-satisfying job, is the only thing that I can say. It is when you walk into a room and the faces light up of the people who you walk into a room and faces light up, and people hug you, and you are meaningful to people. You make their experience in the moment a better one. It's an extraordinary feeling, and I think that you get, although you give an awful lot in that job, you get an enormous amount back. When I first started working there, I thought, geez, why don't these women take a job as like a cashier in Safeway? You get a lot more money. You get benefits. It's clean. You don't have to, you can scan the packages of Depends as they go across, as opposed to actually opening them up and using them, which we did. And but that's a soulless job. And this is, you feel important. You feel, and a lot of those women don't have that kind of stuff in their lives. So it is also a calling in a way.
So working there, was it like a daily thing or an hourly thing where you'd be working with someone and it would cause you to have a reflection on what had transpired with your mom?
Well, certainly not hourly. I think I probably would have driven myself crazy that way. At the beginning, I think that I did think a lot about my mother when I first started this job. I had thought that I'd work about 2 or 3 weeks for this job, that was really what I needed to do to immerse myself in this, to write the story, to write the book. And as I was just saying, it seduced me with how people needed me and how important I was in their lives. Momentarily, I want to say. I want to make sure to say that what I learned in this job and for this book is that people who have Alzheimer's do not stop experiencing the world. I mean, I think that some people believe that people who have Alzheimer's are just sort of like zombies, that their body's walking around without anything inside of them. And I absolutely don't think that's true. At the very end of the disease, that's maybe I might admit something like that. But in general, they can experience life intensely, but in a fragmentary, momentary way. And as long as you can be in the moment with them, whether that moment is listening to music, music is a way of connecting with these people in a very extraordinary way, or touch or smell. One of the things we did in this facility is it was part of the job description, you have to bake cookies every afternoon. Consequently, I gained 15 pounds while I worked there. And some of the people never ate the cookies, but the whole place smelled like grandma's kitchen. And so smell, I mean, when your brain is not working in that logical, cognitive, rational way that a healthy brain is working, it doesn't mean it's not working. So there's connections with the other senses. And we did everything we could in that facility to make the experience from moment to moment an enjoyable one, even though, say, a family member coming in to visit who would have said, "So, Mom, what did you do today?" The mom would have not remembered anything and said nothing. And in fact, Mom would have I saw the expression on Mom's face when she was listening to the music, and she was transported, but she does not going to remember. So you can be sad about that and say, and I was, when it was my mother, I was very sad about that. I would go out of my way to create an experience for her, whether it was music or taking a walk in a park. And then I would, of course, want to debrief later. Wasn't that fun? Aren't you glad we went? And she, had no memory that we did that. That, for me, took away the joy of having done it, which is, which is not right. But when I worked with the people who weren't my mother, I was able to stay in the moment and feel that intense joy that some of them feel. By the way, they fell in love with each other. They had, seriously, they had romances. There was one unit, one neighborhood where we joked and we called it, I called the place Maplewood, which is not its real name. I changed it for privacy purposes, but we called it Maplewood 90210, or the Old and the Restless, because they're constant. Well, there are two men there, and men are, regardless of what kind of a guy you were for the rest of your life, when you're 80 years old and you're a guy in there, you are Mr. Popularity. So any woman who still had an inkling of the male-female thing was after these two guys. And it was really funny to watch. And there were female friendships, and there's a lot going on. There's a lot of life there.
So based on everything you learned there, what would you, if anything, have done differently with your relationship with your mom when she had Alzheimer's, and or what would you recommend to people out there whose parents and loved ones have Alzheimer's?
Well, I think probably I can answer those two questions with the same answers. The whole thing I was just mentioning about staying in the moment is, I think, the biggest lesson for me, that keeping in mind that that people who have Alzheimer's are indeed experiencing reality. They might not be able to tell you about it or talk about it. If you know that, and if you stay in the moment with them and enjoy those moments for just what they are, and then they're gone, and then you don't have to talk about them or remember them or debrief about them, and that's what I should have done, and that's a big lesson for me, and I would encourage people to do that. There's also, there are two competing theories of how to deal with, how to interact with people who have memory problems, not just Alzheimer's. And one is called reality orientation, and one is called validity. And reality orientation is what most of us do. In other words, Grandpa's forgetting something, and he's, saying, I'm going to go fishing with my father, tomorrow. And we all know that his father died 50 years ago. So we jump in and we say, oh, Grandpa, exasperatedly, Grandpa, your father died 50 years ago. You're going fishing with your son, And so we correct. And what that does is it creates a confrontation. It creates anxiety. And if you're dealing with an Alzheimer's person, you're constantly doing that. You're constantly correcting them. And so they can get paranoid, and they can start having what are called behaviors. And basically, you are causing the behaviors. The disease is actually not causing the behaviors. Or you can go to validity, which is what I learned how to do with people other than my mother, which is to respect where they are. And you don't have to lie about it, but if Grandpa says he's going fishing with his father, you can say something like, how nice you get to spend time with your family. I mean, why not just, make it a nice thing? You don't have to say, which family member it is. And I was doing radio a couple of days ago in a call-in show, and some guy called in and said, it was heartbreaking, and said his father, his grandfather, had forgotten that, I think it was his father, had forgotten that the mother had died, so that every day he has to remind the father that his wife is dead because he has Alzheimer's and he can't remember. And I thought, why in the world would you want to do that to somebody? What a blessing that they forgot. I mean, there's some things that are great. My mother forgot she was a smoker. Yay! I was talking to some other woman last night, and her mother forgot that they had a contentious, horrible relationship their whole life. So their mother all of a sudden turned out to be sweet with Alzheimer's. I mean, some things are worth forgetting. So validity, I would say, honoring where they are and staying in the moment.
Finally, do you think that the Alzheimer care facilities we have are a good solution? Can we be doing something else?
I think that at a certain point, it's very, very difficult for people to care for those with Alzheimer's at home. I think that that a good care facility can be the safest, most humane way of taking care of someone who needs 24-hour care and who needs to not be wandering the streets and that kind of stuff. I think that a place like Maplewood, which was designed by people who understood the Alzheimer's brain, they had a lot of good things about the design that allowed for wandering, for example, that made it possible for people to not feel like they were in prison, that flooded the place with light, and the wonderful smells and bringing in the music and that kind of thing, I think is something that an individual family would have a very difficult time doing. I think that we need to pay, train, and honor caregivers in the same way that we should be doing for those who care for people at the beginning of life as well. And we pay people who collect garbage more than we pay elder care and child care people.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you for spending time with us today.
You are very welcome.
We've just been talking with Lauren Kessler. She is author of the new book, Dancing with Rose, Finding Life in the Land of Alzheimer's.